Mr. President, in just 3 days, barring some action by Congress, the Treasury Department of the United States for preventing default on this nation's debts for the first time in our history, setting off a chain of economic events that will be felt around the world and by every family and business and state and community in our country. We have heard a great deal, Mr. President, on this floor the last few days about how we arrived at this point and who's to blame, and there's a lot of concern and consternation about exactly who owns this and how we got here. I'm not going to spend time today on that. I'm going to skip the politics and the drama for now and just talk about the facts and the policy. I just want to talk to Delawareans about what would happen if we actually go over this impending cliff, if we do default, and which of the options for addressing this are viable. First, let's be clear about what we're even talking about. What is the debt ceiling? Defaulting on our debt by failing to raise the debt ceiling is not the same as cutting up America's credit cards. It's not the same as denying the president the right to sign more checks into the future. Raising the debt ceiling does not give Congress or the president a blank check to spend more money. It allows the United States to borrow more money, yes, but only to pay bills for goods and services already incurred, to meet pledges already made. We've had some kind of a national debt ceiling since 1917, when Congress allowed the Treasury Department to issue long-term Liberty bonds to pay for the First World War. Over the course of the next 2 decades, caps were placed on other kinds of debt as well, and finally in 1939, Congress decided to place a ceiling on the total amount of debt the country could have. The last time Congress raised this debt ceiling, it was up to $16.699 trillion. And technically, we reached that limit a few months ago, actually on May 19th of this year. The Treasury Department has since been using what it calls extraordinary measures to keep paying our bills. But as Secretary Lew has communicated to this Congress over and over in letter and in testimony, in just a few days, the Treasury Department will no longer have enough money to keep up. These extraordinary measures will have run out. And within a week or two later, we will end up at zero. So what are the bills? What are the bills that we need to raise this ceiling in order to pay? Well, it's the salaries of all federal employees, including our military. It's Social Security and Medicare payments. It's unemployment benefits, tax refunds, and interest on our sovereign debt. Raising the debt limit allows the Treasury to borrow the money it needs to pay these bills. That's it. If on any particular day more bills come due than we have cash in our accounts to cover, then the United States of America will default on some or all of its obligations. And that day is coming, and coming quickly. And frankly, we cannot let it happen. For decades, investors have bought U.S. debt because it was seen as a sure thing, a safe investment. When people buy a Treasury bill, a T-bill, they do so because they know they're going to earn interest on one of the safest investments in the world. American debt is considered unimpeachable. That's what makes the dollar the reserve currency for much of the world, something that benefits every American company and community and family in ways that are hard to see, but cumulatively powerful. The absolute certainty that we will repay our national debts. So who are these investors? Who are the folks who buy these T-bills? Some are everyday Americans. A large number of retirees invest in our government bonds because they're such a safe bet. Pension funds, mutual funds invest in government bonds for the same reason. Some investors are the governments of other nations who look to the U.S. as such a good investment that they tie their financial stability to ours. So when it starts to look like Congress won't live up to that standard, won't take the steps necessary to pay all of our bills on time, and might actually default on some of our debts and transform us into a deadbeat nation, it makes investors really nervous. Just the talk of defaulting on our debt sends shockwaves through our economy and through the markets. For proof, we need only look back to August of 2011, when Congress last brought the nation to the brink of default. Although we didn't cross the line, just the talk of it, the mere possibility that we might for the first time default, had an array of consequences. First, it slowed job growth and led to an increase in part-time employment. Second, consumer confidence in our economy fell. Consumer confidence, the index of consumer confidence, is a reliable indicator of Americans' willingness to spend money and fuel our economic growth. We want consumers buying products at their local stores and helping keep people employed, right? Well, the index was already on the negative, the pessimistic side of the line when this latest crisis began, but fell substantially since the start of the government shutdown. Instability and uncertainty reduces consumer confidence and takes money out of our economy. Third, the yield of our Treasury bills had to increase in order to prop up demand. As U.S. debt becomes perceived as riskier, we have to incentivize investors by increasing what we will pay them, the potential yield. That means taxpayers have to pay more in order to compensate. The debate in 2011 will in the end cost taxpayers an additional $19 billion in interest over the coming decade. Let me say that again. Just the debate as we ran up to the possibility of default in 2011 added $19 billion in debt service costs to the bonds that were issued in the days and months after. The credit rating agency Standard & Poor's, one of the big three, lowered the United States credit rating, causing markets to drop 5% in a single day and 17% over the course of that crisis. It was one of the worst declines in the equity markets in history, and was only because we talked about defaulting. So just threatening to default is terrible for our economy in all these four different ways. Financial analysts across the world have said Congress is already causing potentially lasting damage to the strength of the dollar just by repeatedly threatening to default. Said one, quote, "There's a negative confidence shock rippling through the economy, and foreign investors have taken fright at developments in Washington." Said another, quote, "A U.S. government default is not a zero probability event anymore. Although it remains very unlikely, a low probability but very high impact event, like U.S. default, is naturally making investors cautious," end of quote. So we simply can't afford this talk. We can't let our nation default. What happens if we do? What would actually happen if we get to the end of this week and have not resolved this crisis? And I'm encouraged by rumors of some resolution. I'm encouraged that there are negotiations and conversations going on, but I think we need to look in a clear-eyed way about what happens should default actually occur. Well, for starters, it's important to say we don't really know. The situation's never been this bad before, and the United States has never defaulted on its debt. Here's what the managing director of the International Monetary Fund said this weekend, quote, "If there is that degree of disruption, that lack of certainty, that lack of trust in the U.S. signature, it would mean massive disruption the world over, and we would be at risk of tipping yet again into global recession. Mr. President, we simply can't afford that." Let me share with you another quote from history from President Ronald Reagan, who back in 1983 had this to say about the potential threat of default and its impact on our economy. President Reagan said, quote, "The full consequences of a default, or even the serious prospect of a default by the United States, are impossible to predict and awesome to contemplate. Denigration of the full faith and credit of the United States would have substantial effects on the domestic financial markets and the value of the dollar." As that was true back in 1983, so it is true again today. And the comments from the head of the IMF and from a whole array of economists and bankers this past week remind us of this simple and enduring truth, that the modern era has been one where the dollar has been the reserve currency for the world, and where the strength of the American market has been critical to the strength of the American nation, our communities, and our economy. And frankly, to put that at risk over short-term political differences is reckless indeed. What we know is that we'll wake up on Friday, this coming Friday, with about $30 billion in the federal government's accounts. This is according to Treasury Secretary Lew. What we don't know is how long it will last. And the moment we can't pay one of our bills, we will default. That's what's known as the X date. The government will still collect revenue, but it won't be enough to keep pace with our daily bills. Over the last year, the government collected an average of $7.5 billion a day and spent an average of $9.7 billion a day. That means about $2.2 billion short on our bills every day if we aren't borrowing to make up the difference. Analysts at the Bipartisan Policy Center suggest we'll run out of cash hitting that X date, roughly October 22nd. So look at the bills that start stacking up at that point. And to be clear, part of why we don't know exactly what date this would occur is because money flows into the federal Treasury at uneven rates, and it flows out at uneven rates. So let's just look at a few of the bills that are about to come due in the next few weeks. On October 23rd, $12 billion in Social Security benefits are due. On October 28th, $3 billion in federal salaries would go unpaid. On October 30th, another $2 billion, this time in Medicaid payments, are due. On October 31st, Halloween, $6 billion in interest payments on our sovereign debt are due. On November 1st, $58 billion in Medicare, Social Security, and SSI payments, as well as veterans benefits and military pay. Well, these are just the major bills. There's thousands, even millions of smaller payments that are due from every agency and entity of the federal government that go up and down day in and day out, and where our failure to pay in a timely fashion, while technically not default on our sovereign debt, would put in question our ability and willingness as a government to pay our bills when due. With what we have left, we won't be able to pay them all, and will be in violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which says the debt of the United States shall not be questioned. If we haven't raised the debt ceiling by this Thursday, we are likely to see disturbing losses in global markets. We've already started to see them as uncertainty takes over and volatility begins to spread. Investors are already pulling money out of our T-bills. And if 2011 is an indication, stock prices will soon begin to drop in the absence of some progress towards a resolution. Deutsche Bank, one of the world's most prominent investment banks, predicted the S&P 500 will fall by a staggering 45% if we default. And we heard loud and clear when we met with the rating agencies after the 2011 incident that they will almost certainly downgrade the credit rating of the United States, which reduced demand for treasuries, particularly among investment funds required to hold AAA securities. With the nation pressed up against its debt ceiling and future interest payments uncertain, investors will be hesitant to buy more T-bills. The toxicity of U.S. debt may spread to Treasury notes and bonds, and investors will almost certainly demand higher yields, which will cost our country significantly more over time. This is what happened, I remind you, in 2011 when we merely flirted with default. Right now, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Instead of keeping their money in cash, other nations buy our debt in order to get interest without risk. America has been a great investment, and defaulting would cause other nations to sell our debt, then sell our dollars, weakening our dollars against foreign currencies and raising the costs on every single good imported into the U.S. If Treasury interest rates go up just 1 percentage point, it would add over $1 trillion in the next decade to our debt service costs. Anything we've saved because of sequestration would be gone, and there's no reason to think default would only cause interest rates to go up by 1 point. They could add $2 or $3 trillion to our debt over the next decade in just a matter of days. And this also affects everyone in our community and our country, from large to small, from companies to communities to families. When Treasury interest rates go up, your interest rates go up. Mortgage rates, auto loans, student loans, business loans, they all go up, and they can go up fast. Default would make it harder for all of us to use credit responsibly, and as consumers would buy less, business profits would fall, GDP would fall, and the nation again would enter a recession. Defaulting on our debt would be an unimaginable drag on the economic health of our country, our communities, and our families, and we cannot let it happen. Mr. President, I see that my colleague, Senator Mikulski, has joined me here on the floor, and if I might, with her forbearance, I will take a few minutes to review just a few points here and then yield to her.
I'm happy to yield to have the gentleman from Delaware continue, a newest member of the Appropriations Committee, but I think you're really articulating something that everybody needs to understand, and I'm happy to wait my turn.
Thank you, Senator Mikulski. I'm briefly going to, in conclusion, touch on what are our options. Because we've heard, all of us have heard on this floor, senators suggest that default is really not that big a deal, that we're not really going to default, that there's other ways around this, and that we needn't be scared into making some hurried deal, and that at the end of the day, several senators have accused the president of fear-mongering and have accused my party of suggesting that default is a major threat to our country and our economy, when in fact it's not. Let me briefly touch on the options that have been discussed by other senators, frankly, to my surprise. First, some have suggested we can pay our bills not when they're due, but when we have the money, sort of a first-come, first-served payment approach. So let's say we ran out of money, as I suggested, on the 20th this month and couldn't pay our bills on the 21st. By the 23rd, we'd have enough money, so we'd pay the bills for the 21st, but go delinquent on bills for the 22nd and 23rd and so on. This is crazy. Payments would be delinquent and the United States would fall back on its debt. This option would only make our situation worse. We would keep adding over $2 billion in debt every single day while going delinquent on our bills to Americans. Second way forward, some have suggested prioritize certain bills, but just ignore others. The Treasury Department would continue to make payments on our sovereign debt, so the Chinese would get paid, but they would avoid or default on lots and lots of other obligations. Which payments would we choose in this body not to make? Social Security, Medicare, military salaries, payments for cancer research, veterans benefits, food inspectors, air traffic controllers. Who goes first and how do you possibly choose? These are the ludicrous sorts of choices that have been sent to us by the other chamber as they've attempted to fund the government in piecemeal slices in the past week. The Treasury Department makes 100 million payments per month, making this option a logistical nightmare. Frankly, if we prioritize our payments, it's not a question if we go into recession, a question would be when. Because we would be taking $2.2 billion out of our economy a day, 4% of GDP out of our nation's economy on an annualized basis. This would push us back into recession and would still be defaulting on our obligations, and the markets and the credit rating agencies would know it. The other thing that's been suggested is to work around the debt ceiling. There's a whole parcel of creative but legally questionable ideas. Minting $1 trillion coin, avoiding the 14th Amendment, a fire sale of U.S. assets, super premium treasuries. Each one of them has pros and cons I won't go into now, but they would face legal scrutiny and would radically increase uncertainty in the markets. There is no better option for us going forward than to reopen the government, pay our national debt on time, raise the debt ceiling, and honor our obligations as a country. That's the fourth and only good option, to pay our bills, to prevent default, to put a floor under our economy, to stop these games, and to stop suggesting that there's any way out of this other than doing our jobs, preserving the AAA credit rating of this country, and making this country worthy of global respect again. Mr. President, in conclusion, I can't believe that members in this chamber who had the chance to avoid default on Saturday voted in a way that suggested they chose not to. Not only did it rattle me, it rattled the markets. The idea that a sovereign government would have the ability to pay its debts but actively choose not to is unprecedented. It cannot be allowed to happen. We cannot allow this country to become a bad investment. We will not become a deadbeat nation. We need to pay our bills, do the right thing, and avoid default. Mr. President, it's time we stopped playing games and did right by the American people.